presenting. Hello everyone, my name is Aniano, and this is my presentation for my Aegs206 final at Asian Pacific Islander Studies. On to the next slide. This is the introduction and overview of what we'll be going over in my presentation. And so we have a quote here from Apele Hauofa, who is the main source of my presentation. He's the author of We Are the Ocean, which is a collection of his assorted essays going over various topics which we'll be drawing from. Among those topics are cultural and historical topics, health and well-being topics, socio-economic and political topics, and environmental topics. All this relating back to the Pacific Islander people of the South Pacific. Right. So, cultural and historical identity. The Pacific Islands and the indigenous inhabitants of those islands have a really unique and distinctive culture, very much different and unique from anything else in the world. So that culture stems from a voyaging heritage of which the South Pacific peoples are derived from, and so their Polynesian ancestors long ago, in order to colonize various islands in the South Pacific, went on long voyages on pontoon craft like catamarans, canoes, and in these seafaring journeys, it became ingrained into Pacific Islander culture. It became ingrained into their mythology and as well as their cultural practices. And we can see this in this view of Hauofa. And you'll see in this bullet point, islands versus ocean. Hauofa posits that the colonial view of Pacific peoples being isolated on tiny resource deprived islands is I'd say deplorable. There's a better way to say it, but instead, Hauofa argues that they inhabit a vast sea of interconnected peoples, cultures, and histories. The vast sea here could be the vast sea here could be in reference to the literal sea, which connects trade and societies in the South Pacific, but also it could link to a shared history, touching on the voyaging heritage, as well as a web of interconnectedness. And then the smallness and stand-nine. So colonialism imparted upon the Oceanian peoples a mentality of smallness instead of mind. Hauofa argues that these restrictions are unnatural and temporary, and we can prove this by the diaspora. And so, here, just for reference, here's a map, though I hope the quality would be better, of the Polynesian forebears journeys. We can see in the top left here that they originate somewhere from mainland Asia. They travel down through the Philippines, touching Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands. They believe that's Vanuatu, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, the Cook Islands. They touch New Zealand, the Easter Islands. I believe those are the Marshall Islands, and then they touch Hawaii last year. We'll look at that. And so the diaspora in indigenous sovereignty. And so we touched previously on the diaspora in the previous slide, but we can see here on the right some numbers I grabbed from the most recent U.S. Census. I believe, no, this is the 2020 census. I believe there is a 2025 census going on. It's every 5 years. But we can see that in the United States as a whole, we have almost 900,000 Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander peoples. This is no surprise, considering that the U.S. incorporates Pacific Islands, Hawaii, and the U.S. Marshall Islands and American Samoa, to name a few, but also the diaspora from other South Pacific islands and island nations also reside in the U.S. And so, in some specific Pacific Islander groups, the growth of those populations has increased by about 300%, almost just under. and of those populations, we're counting three: Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. And so, uh, how how OFA celebrates diaspora in communities across the world: Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, Canada, and the U.S. As he celebrates them as extensions of the ancient voyaging traditions. So, in a sense, it's tying back traditional indigenous knowledge to modern cultural and practical practices. Of course, and I'm referencing my own cultural background in with the Philippines. There is a large Filipino diaspora and across the world, and very similar to the diaspora of the Pacific Islander nations. And so it really is a web of relationships, culturally and racially, I guess, in the world. It's no longer this idea of a smallness and state of mind and isolated islands. It's a network of people across the world, and interdependency and not dependency for here. For this is really a problem in terms of national sovereignty and not just sovereignty in the state that a nation is able to manage their own affairs. It's sovereignty in the state of spiritual, language, cultural, and not just political. And so, Haufa, in this quote here, is referencing a system of which where Southeast South Pacific islands are resource dependent on foreign nations for aid. These foreign nations can and are often former colonial powers, often the colonial powers that previously uh, governed or ruled these South Pacific islands. A good example of this is American Samoa and Samoa with the United States. Another good example would be, I believe, Fiji, which is still French under French sovereignty. Um, and so Alpha argues that for sovereignty for the Pacific peoples, that they should be interdependent on one another and not dependent on uh, a foreign nation for aid. Right. This goes back to the idea of this interconnectedness, the sea of peoples, the sea of islands, and this web of peoples, interconnected and interdependent upon each other. And then sovereignty and identity. And so sovereignty for Pacific communities is not just political; it's cultural, linguistic, and spiritual. During colonial times, often the colonial powers would restrict native indigenous populations in means of culture, in means of religion, in means of linguistics. I will use the Philippines for an example because that's where I'm from. When the Spanish came in the 1500s, they restricted our culture, our linguistics, and our spirituality. And so that can be explained by, in the modern day, almost every, well, no, a large percentage of the Filipino population in the mainland Philippines is Catholic. Um, that also explains why there's Spanish loanwords in the Filipino language, Tagalog. It's this cultural impact, this cultural rubbing off of colonizer culture onto um, Pacific communities. And so, for Pacific communities to truly be sovereign, they must reclaim um, their own cultural, linguistic, and spiritual sovereignty, which is rooted in the right to define their own futures. Moving on, colonialism and militarism in the Pacific, and so we briefly had touched on this earlier, but these colonial powers, they didn't go away. Instead, the relationship between these powers changed as the time changed, and so with the belittlement in back in the colonial era, colonial and missionary contact systematically told the Pacific peoples that they were savages. How Alpha traces how derogatory and belittling indigenous views of culture and traceable were early, pardon, how derogatory and belittling views of indigenous cultures are traceable to the early years of interaction with Europeans. Um, this view often has not changed, even up to the, the 20th century. Um, though I did not include this in my presentation, a good example of this were the human zoos across the world. Uh, the human zoos, for context, were a novelty exhibition during the imperial era, back when colonial powers were empiring, and so they would collect families of their subject nations and put them in a zoo and mimic, and I say mimic in quotations, their natural culture. And so this was all just a big to make fun of these cultures. It was incredibly culturally insensitive at the time, of course. That is the belittlement I want to bring it to attention now. And so all these quotes are from Haufa, or direct quotes from the Haufa's "We Are the Ocean." The 19th century imperialism erected boundaries that led to contraction of Oceania, transforming once boundless world into Pacific islands and territories we know today. Uh, this is in reference to basically colonial powers drawing lines on maps, splitting up once what was a boundless, interconnected, interdependent system of Pacific peoples into stagnant and stagnant communities of colonial power. I'd say that's the best way I would explain it. And then resistance. Um, Halifa calls on islanders to reclaim their identity. We must not allow anyone to belittle us again and take away our freedom. Um, resistance is cultural, political, and psychological. Resistance is not just a state of being; it is a state of mind. It is a state of action, uh, and we can see this with how in the 1800s in New Zealand, the Maori were actively resisting English rule there in um, in the Philippines. To use that just because I'm familiar with what happened there in their history there. In the post, no, pre World War One in 1900, I believe the Philippines revolted, and so Pacific Islanders. It's not just a state of revolution, but is resistance culturally. Resistance culturally can look like reclaiming indigenous practices, and then also, uh, despite of colonial sentiments of such practices. Politically, it can look something like a political stance against further dependence uh, upon a foreign, not perchance adversary, but a foreign nation. Um, and then psychologically as well is the mental idea of resistance, that you're no longer influenced or stripped of your freedoms from a foreign being. A oops, an example of political and cultural and like absolute resistance, in my opinion, would be the nation of Hawaii. The nation of Hawaii is a political organization that an activist group as well that that posits that they want separation and sovereignty from the United States. And they, to my knowledge, from my understanding, and that of course I could be wrong, they have land of which that they own directly, that is not owned by the state of Hawaii and that is not owned by the government of the United States, of which they are self-sufficient. And in my mind, that embodies self-reliance and sovereignty in the and absolute resistance to colonialism and colonialism. And talking about militarism, these colonial powers use their relationships with these small and, to their mind, insignificant island nations to commit military operations. For example, American Samoa, there's a very large military base there. Samoa is now a choke point, I'd say, in the South Pacific against the United States political adversaries in that region, much to the dismay, no, more to the displeasure of the native Samoans there, who now have to deal with a very large military base and the political risks of geopolitical tension in that region. This was also the case with the Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands for the U.S., where in the 60s and 50s they tested nuclear weapons. Uh, that effect is still lasting and affecting the residents of those islands to this day. We can see that in displacement, radiation contamination, health effects from years on years end. Moving on, health and well-being for Pacific Islander communities. And so this quote here is from the foreword of Halifa's We Are the Ocean. So diabetes and obesity. Pacific Islanders face disproportionately higher rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity, linked to shifts away from traditional diets and subsistence practices after colonialization. Um, yes, this is yeah, and so they're also at risk for they're at significant disadvantage when it comes to seeking out um, health health services compared to the average citizen on the continental U.S. There simply isn't many comparable facilities, and there isn't expertise. Well, isn't as much expertise in these island nations compared to their more developed counterparts across the world, and this is all a result of colonization and the barriers that were erected there. And so these mental health barriers, right? Part of it is language barrier, right? Part of it is cultural stigma, culture um, from Islander culture, that mental health is not as important as physical health, and so it is all these barriers and all these obstacles to health come from healthcare inequality, which also stems from the economic inequality between former colonial powers and former colonies of those powers, in reference to the South Pacific Islands. And then community-based solutions to those problems. Halifa visions a community-centered interventions rooted in indigenous values to offer culturally resonant and effective ways to approach health equity. In plain English, this is resolving cultural cultural practices, either reaching back into the past or melding traditional practices into the modern era as an effective response and approach, community oriented, of course, to healthcare inequity. And so the socioeconomic and political realities, of course, I touched on that in the previous slide, but the biggest problem here is that these South Pacific Islands aren't sovereign. Well, they have they have limited sovereignty, despite being sovereign in name. In reality, they are dependent on former colonial powers, and so structural inequality. There's Halifa observed a rising class division of post colonial Pacific societies. He quotes that there is a elite class of people who will meld cultural practices into essentially a begging for foreign aid. This reinforces the dependencies that their nation already relies upon, and that it furthers economic inequality and furthers the healthcare inequality, which I touched on in a previous slide. The development paradox is a quote which was brought under Hau'ofa. And so it's is reference to climate change, which disproportionately affects uh, South Pacific Islanders, specifically their sovereign lands. Let's say their homeland. Rising sea levels uh, rapidly decrease the amount of viable land available in their nations as sea levels rise. Flooding increases, structural damage increases, agricultural damage increases, and this disproportionately affects those in South Pacific Islands because simply of geography. And so here, development, we'll see here, the development paradox relates back to this key theme here I have on the right. So, quote from Halifa, development creates poverty even in societies that may be largely self-sufficient outside the cash economy. This is referencing and tying back into the idea of this dependency, which I talked about in the colonial part and often throughout this presentation. Right. Environmental and climate and oceanic stewardship. I talked about this briefly, the stewardship, sea level rise. Specifically, how it highlights the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, mostly atoll nations. So atoll nations, like those listed before, are particularly um, in danger of the rising sea levels due to just limited elevation in those nations. The nuclear legacy, which affects the environment of these nations where they're tested upon, leaving it's not permanent, but is permanent for the duration of our lifetimes. This environmental damage and nuclear contamination of these environments will last far beyond. It will last multiple lifetimes. Overfishing and pollution, and so unsustainable fishing practices, marine pollution threaten the ecosystems of Pacific peoples, which they have stewarded for millennia, undermining food security and cultural identity. Um, in indigenous practices, often along with cultural and religious practices, often tied Pacific peoples to the environment. They've been stewards of the environment for millennia, and so overfishing, pollution, nuclear contamination of environments is affect deeply affects the South Pacific peoples and indigenous solutions. Now we can go back to the indigenous cultural practices of the past, and as well as newly developed solutions and strategies by the indigenous population of these nations to combat these issues. Traditional ecological knowledge, sustainable fishing practices, resource management, and all these offer uh, proven and community-led pathways for environmental protection, environmental stewardship of which the South Pacific peoples have been stewards of for millennia, directly tying back into food security and cultural identity. Arts, culture, and creative resistance. Resistance is a state of mind, is a state of being. Absolute resistance can take place in the form of art and language. And we can see this in Halafa's quotes here, and the Oceania Center for Arts and Culture. And there's similar schools for art and culture elsewhere, but it's really a reclamation of art and culture that was no longer being taught or was being lost because it was not deemed important enough, right? Despite the growing importance of culture in today's modern world. And so, if you look to the next page, we have an example of tapa cloth, which is a ceremonial. Well, it can be ceremonial, but it was a type of paper or cloth made from the bark made by the indigenous populations across the South Pacific. This example here is from an archive from the Natural History Museum. And so art can be a state of resistance. In conclusion, waking up to an ancient truth. That ancient truth is the we are the sea. The South Pacific peoples are a sea of islands connected to one another by an ancient Voyager history a shared history, a shared culture, interdependence economically, culturally, and by the spirit of resistance against the colonizers uh, and forces of which that mean to strip these people of their sovereignty. And so, Pacific Islander, the key points of this are the Pacific Islander communities are defined by their resilience, interconnectedness, self-determination, and then that they're not isolated, they're not dependent on they don't have to be dependent on foreign nations. Cultural expression, indigenous knowledge, and it's not just indigenous cultural practices, but new innovations made by these indigenous populations, environmental stewardship, and all that is inseparable from political and social justice, of which is incredibly important in our modern world. And oops, oh dear. Hauofa invites us to reimagine Oceania as not small islands lost in the sea, but a vast living network, this vast living world, constantly and ever expanding. And then understanding Oceania and Pacific Islander studies requires centering indigenous voices, their histories, and their future on their own terms. They are their own sovereign people, really. They are, indeed, yes. And moving on, we have Works Cited in APA format. Unfortunately, I could not get the citations for the images, which is deeply unfortunate. The citation machine just was not working. But thank you for being with me for the past 25 minutes.